good afternoon. For those who don't know, I'm joined today by Geoff Thompson, who is currently Socials Chairman, Socials FC Chairman, but also a very, very successful businessman in your own right. So welcome, Geoff.
Well, thank you, Phil, for that introduction. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your time today. So to go back a while, shall we say, and you studied university and things like that, and you end up with a master's degree. Understand?
Yeah, I mean, how far do you want to go back? I guess to give a very quick potted history, I was born in South Shields, Whiteleys, 260 Whiteleys Way, born at home, as was I think the case, more and more back then. Back in the day, absolutely. And then I'll miss out a few steps, but basically went to school. Went to junior school in Cranford Street. Well, lived in Cranford Street. Went to Stanhope Road Junior School. Passed me 11 plus. My mum and dad bought a house in Jarrow, so I moved to Jarrow. Went to what was Springfield Grammar School back in the day. Then became a comprehensive, of course. And then jumping a few steps, left school at 16. Started my apprenticeship. Funnily enough, it's Shaftesbury Avenue, which is where the football club is, so I've not moved too far in the last 45 years. Started my apprenticeship as a sort of apprentice sheet metal worker stroke technician, so I spent a bit of time in the drawing office at a company called Burgess Industrial Silencers, if anybody might remember that. Anyway, into that period, realised perhaps I should have carried on studying. I was doing a bit of work studying, that is, at Hebburn Technical College. So I did what was called a tech diploma at the college, and then thought, no, I really made a mistake, leaving full-time education. So I ended up applying to Sunderland Polytechnic, as it was then. Did my first degree, got a first-class honours in a combined science degree, and then did a postgraduate diploma. By then I started to work at British Steel down in Teesside as a metallurgist. Then did a postgraduate diploma in management studies. That took 2 years part-time. And then, as you said, I did my MBA at Newcastle University and finished that in 1988, I think, 89.
So when you jump back into education, you jump in with both feet?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's everybody's path's different, isn't it? But I mean, for me, I kind of just thought, maybe I'd left full-time education a little bit too early. And I took a bit of a risk, because for those of us old enough to remember, late 70s, I left school 78. There was still at that time quite a few jobs around, the yards were still open, the mines. So I'd got this apprenticeship, and of course, literally no more than 2 years later, that whole situation had changed dramatically. So I was wrapping up my apprenticeship to go back go back to university stroke poly, and when I didn't think about it at the time, but probably took a bit of a risk because I was leaving that behind. I hadn't finished my apprenticeship, so the risk was that I'd go off to uni and then end up failing, of course. But thankfully, I didn't. And without boring everybody to death, or you, Phil, particularly, I think the one message that I think of, or that I try and communicate when I reflect on my own life, is one of just hard work and persistence, because when I left that apprenticeship and started at the poly, it was, I knew I'd taken that risk. So it was a question of knuckling down and working really hard. And there were a lot of brighter lads than me at Sunderland Polytechnic at the time, but I managed to get, as I say, a first-class honours degree. But not because I was the brightest lad in the poly by any stretch. It's just down to hard work, just absolute graft. So I was in the poly library more than I was in the Students' Union bar.
Well, you very much made the most of what you had and the opportunity that you had.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I mean, just as I say, just a lot of hard work, persistence, perspiration, graft, and maybe a little bit of dollop of luck as well, because, I left the poly with the first class honours, and by the way, I'm not trying to be smug with that, I'm just making the point that I got it through hard work, and then I went off to British Steel down at Lackenby, Had a great couple of years there. Then joined Corning in Sunderland, Corning Glass. And it was during that period, as I say, I was working full time. Recently married, but then studying part time to do that DMS, that postgraduate diploma, and then did my MBA. So yeah, it's I could bore you all afternoon with that one.
It's not boring at all. It's very interesting to hear that, you know, again, timing can be a lot, but you made those choices at what you felt were the right times for
you. I think, I mean, it could have turned out differently. But I think, you know, here I am, I'm a 60-year-old bloke now, and I kind of look back, and as with all of us, you know, we're all capable of making mistakes, and equally sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that applies to so many people, me included, by the way. You know, my life's not been this bed of roses and this sort of smooth success by any stretch, whatever anybody might think of me. That's far from the truth. But what I would say is it's just been, as I keep repeating, one of hard work, persistence, not giving up, and when you are faced with a few challenges and a few difficulties, just having a go again, you know. And that's been my motto in my own personal life, just to keep going and not being afraid to fail is quite important, you know, just having a go. And if you do get knocked back, you pick yourself back up and have another go. And I know that sounds a bit of a cliche, but it's so true, because you know, it's often the case that people get a bit of a knock in life, or whether it's in their education or in their work, or, you know, they get made redundant, or, you know, whatever event might take place. It's so easy just to sort of throw in the towel, and certainly I've always tried to just carry on whenever I've been faced with difficult circumstances.
I think there's that fear of failure. It kind of can cripple people at times, can't it, really? Yeah,
absolutely, and, you know, I've had my own share of that, you know, both personally and professionally, but you've just got to, as I keep repeating, you know, pick yourself up, get through that, and, you know, as I say, I've had some difficult times. I've been made redundant, I've lost my job, I've had legal disputes, you know, I've sadly had marriage failure, you know. There's a lot of things that, like all of us, you know, you get faced with a lot of these things, and it's just about how you cope with them, I guess. And that doesn't mean, by the way, I'm some smart aleck again. It's just you have to, don't you, really get on and press ahead and press on, even when you're faced with some difficult circumstances.
You've obviously shown resilience and things like that, you know, in regards to sort of work life and being made redundant, as you say, or personally the sort of marriage breakdown and stuff like that. But you know, showing that resilience throughout.
Yeah, I think so. I'd like to think so. I think the other thing is, this sounds again a little bit sort of odd perhaps, but whatever you're faced with, always trying to conduct yourself properly, you know. I'm not saying I'm some angel, but I've always, particularly as I've got older, I think it's really important to treat people the way you'd like to be treated. Show politeness and respect. And, you know, that's certainly not weakness. I think it's an important attribute. And I've always tried to apply those basic principles to how I conduct myself and how I behave. And I'd like to think that that's held me in good stead. Because even when you're in a difficult spot, if you keep adhering to certain principles and behaviours, you know, that can get you through.
I think those behaviours are key, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's how you would like to be treated, then, as far as you can anyway, treat other people in the same way.
No, I think it's a really important point. I mean, again, I'm not here to say, well, certainly not here to preach about what anybody should say or do, but, you know, I've just tried to apply those basic principles to my own life. And so far, it's kind of held me in reasonable stead.
Good stuff. So just to go back to your career then, you know, obviously the places that you worked, you know, what sort of roles were you doing within those companies?
Yeah, well, interestingly, after I graduated, I joined British Steel down at Lackenby. Had a great job, actually, when I look back, because I was a graduate trainee and in this sort of management trainee role. But I got posted to different parts of the steel plant, you know, so again, not to bore you to death, but, you know, there was obviously the blast furnace down at Redcar, so remember one of my early jobs was wandering around the blast furnace. I had a series of sort of staircases around the outside of the blast furnace, and the blast furnace at the time was due a reline, and so one of my jobs was to wander around with this infrared camera and a oxygen mask, because there was a risk of carbon monoxide emissions at certain levels on the blast furnace, and wander around just measuring these various heat spots on the outside of the blast furnace, so that when the reline was due, everybody knew where the weak areas of the blast furnace were. So it was jobs like that, and then I got transferred to a technical role where, as a sort of, I was a qualified metallurgist, I suppose, but I was still a trainee in real terms. Yeah. So, if there'd been any sort of plant failure, then we as a sort of technical team had to go in and see what might have caused that plant failure. And then I also worked on the concast plant, which was a continuous casting plant. So, not to give you a lesson in steel making, because I'm a bit rusty on it now, but the iron was produced down at the blast furnace, sent on a torpedo ladle up to the boss plant, and then it was converted to steel, and then you had this sort of 320 ton of liquid steel that would be moved by crane across to the concast plant, and then we continuously cast steel into various sizes. So yeah, it was a great job. I look back with like some fond memories, and it was my first sort of management job, because there I was, sort of still wet behind the ears, 22-year-old or thereabouts, 22 I would have been, and trying to sort of have a supervisory role with a bunch of fairly savvy streetwise steel workers, So I was a bit of a baptism of fire. So that was my first sort of managerial thing, and then I went to Corning Glass in Sunderland and worked in the quality control and quality assurance function there, and then I kind of got a sort of first line management job there when I was still quite young, and that was a great job. I worked for Corning and travelled a lot for them. Corning at the time, is a US owned business, public company, but there's a town called Corning in Upper New York State. So I used to travel over to New York, and then up to get a flight up to Syracuse, and then a flight down to Corning, and then again I had like a sort of technical job. I mean, I was still very wet behind the ears, but I look back again with some sort of pleasant thoughts about how I was being developed as a person. I didn't perhaps appreciate it at the time, but I was doing some international travel in my mid-20s, and used to travel to France. We had a research establishment, a place called Bagnols, just south of Paris, and we also had a manufacturing plant down at Châteauroux. So I travelled quite a bit, and it was during that period I did my MBA, and then I suddenly thought, well, maybe I could. I don't know. It wasn't ambition or greed. I just had this thirst for more knowledge, I suppose, and more experience. So I left Corning and joined Pricewaterhouse, as it was then, as a consultant. So I worked in business consultancy for a few years, and I mean, as I say, I look back, and I could probably write a book on it all, But
you've had a smile on your face when you've been sort of reminiscing.
Yeah, no, it's got. I wasn't really expecting. Sorry, Phil, because I wasn't sure what we were going to cover this afternoon, rather. But you sort of took me back a little bit there. Yeah, it's some good memories. And then at PW, I worked in consultancy and worked for various businesses, and the idea being that we were trying to help them improve, and then I ended up. I ended up working in the energy industry, jumping a few steps, but worked in the outsourcing industry for what was then PowerGen. And then I set up on my own in a small outsourcing capacity, and then eventually created a business that I set up a business in 2006 called Utility Wise, and then I managed to float that on the stock market in 2012. I have to say, backed by a great team of people around me, so it wasn't all my doing by any stretch, but we managed to grow the business successfully, employed a lot of people up here in the northeast and elsewhere. At its peak we had about just under 2,000 staff, so it became a big operation. Some of them abroad over in Prague, but most of them in the UK. And then I stupidly convinced myself I should retire. That was back in 2016, 17. Big regret, really, because, you know, at the time I thought, you know, had I taken the business as far as I could, and I, you know, again, it's easy with the benefit of hindsight, isn't it? But I spent time trying to find a successor, a new chief exec.
Yeah.
And with the greatest respect to the individual concerned, probably made the wrong choice. I then stepped away from the business, and within 18 months or so, it had basically failed. So it was a bit of a bittersweet pill, really. You know, back to my earlier point about disappointments, that's one of them. Thankfully, most people in the business got re-employed because the operating businesses got acquired, but the PLC basically ceased. And so what had been about 12 years of my hard work, and indeed many other people's hard work, came to a bit of a disappointing end, really. But
that's a shame.
Huge regret, I have to say. You know, I when it became clear to me that business was in trouble, I tried to step back and made an offer to buy it, but it was too late, really. I think the bank had lost a bit of confidence, and anyway, again, it's a subject area in its own right. I could spend hours talking about it, but you know, again, the highlight is, you know, I thought at the time I'd made the right decision to think about retiring. Here I am. That was in 2016. Here I am in 2022, and I'm working harder than I ever have. You know, so I definitely made the wrong choice in you know, at the time. But you know, I did it for the right reasons at the time. I thought I was ready to retire, and I wasn't. And as I say, thankfully, most people managed to find other work, and the business got bought up by other competitors. So.
So during that period, then, you know, what was the impact on you? Were you feeling quite stressed or anxious about things, or were you kind of, right, now I need to show my resilience and sort of, as you were saying earlier, sort of that knuckle down and work harder type? How did that really impact you, Geoff?
Well, I think when I growing that business from, you know, 2 or 3 people. Funnily enough, we had an office in Jarrow at St Bede's, just down the road here. So that's where we started. Actually, we started slightly earlier than that in Gateshead, and then moved to Jarrow. But my point is, throughout that period, you know, starting with half a dozen staff and then growing it organically, we were still a privately owned company up until 2012. And in June 2012, I listed it on AIM, which is the alternative investment market. But the reason why I'm mentioning that is, back to your question, that was quite a full-on, quite stressful period. You know, positive stress in the sense that you were trying to grow a business and employ more people. But, you know, like in any business, you know, you've got all these different variables that you've got to manage. People being an important part of it, the finances, various business processes that you've got to manage, IT systems, etc., etc. So there was a lot of moving parts and a lot of complexity that you have to get used to managing. And that's true. That's true in any business. Managing cash flow, you know, keeping the business right. So that was quite a stressful period. And then, obviously, as I say, we listed it in 2012, became a small cap public company. But that meant we had lots of external institutional shareholders. And they brought even more pressure, you know, because you were accountable to them, more so than perhaps as a private company. And there's a certain governance that comes with running a public company, probably a greater corporate governance regime than anybody who's running their own business, because you've got all of these external shareholders and you've got to report to them on a regular basis. So yeah, that was all pretty stressful when I think about it. A lot of fun. I learned a lot. I loved going down to the city and meeting people down there and understanding how that all worked. And I missed that a little, if I'm honest. You know, it was a great experience. Did it for 5 years or so. And then, as I say, probably made the wrong decision towards the end of the business when I felt like I should have, well, as I say, I felt like I should have retired. And then back to your point about stress, when I realised the business was then in trouble after I'd left, and a year or so after I'd left, that's when I tried to sort of buy it back, and some regrets and a little bit more stress, but for different reasons. But, you know, I think it's true. It doesn't matter about me in that sense. I think most people at various points in your life you're faced with challenges and difficulties. And it's always easy to sort of think that everybody else's life is that much easier and smoother.
Absolutely.
And of course it often isn't. We don't really know what's going on in other people's private lives or professional lives. But I'm just simply saying that, yeah, that was a difficult period.
Yeah.
A lot of it was a lot of fun over that period from 2006 to 2016 when the business was going from high growth private company into public company, further growth. We acquired a few businesses, so there was a lot of fun, a lot of hard work, a lot of stress, but great experience. But then, as I say, the final stress was that last piece where the business got into difficulty. I'd left, and I was a little bit too late to try and save it, unfortunately.
Yeah. But I think there's sort of elements within that, though, isn't it? Like, I think some degree of stress isn't a bad thing, because it can bring an energy and a motivation and a focus to your workplace, and it sounds like you embraced that. You really enjoyed the sort of the cut and thrust and visiting the city and things like that, and learning more about it as well.
Yeah, definitely. And stress is probably not the right word, yes, there is a level of stress with anything that anybody does, but you're right, I saw it as just, I thoroughly enjoyed it, saw it as a big challenge. It gave me some real personal purpose, and it's interesting, everyone's wired a different way, but I've never been a greedy person. I've never been particularly materialistic.
Okay.
And that might sound odd, but it's an absolute fact. I've never been driven by, I want to make more money, or money being the driver for anything that I've done. It's always been about, as I say, striving to learn, challenge, making things happen, trying to make a difference. And that sounds a bit corny, but genuinely, I mean that. That's my drivers were always about trying to make things happen, trying to grow something, trying to make a difference. And I loved that intellectual challenge of trying to make all of that work, And I still do. Sadly, one might say, I'm 60-year-old now, and I still get a big buzz out of that. Even, now at the football club, and I'm working with my youngest son. He's got his own business that I support him with. Okay. So yeah, I still get the same buzz. Really, it's a bit of almost a sort of an addiction.
Yeah, and I know you've been sort of quite light-hearted about it, Geoff, and I appreciate that. But I've known you half an hour.
Yeah.
And you're one of those people who just love to learn. It feels like you're one of those lifelong learners, and sometimes it would be nice for somebody to embrace that and have that curiosity and what happens if we do this? And how does this work?
Yeah.
And then can we make it better? And can we, how do we improve things?
Yeah, no, you're right, Phil. And as I said earlier, I think often, sadly, people are afraid of failure.
Yeah.
And in any business that I've been involved in, I've never ever allowed that culture to prevail. People need to be in a position where they can, come up with ideas, try new things, adapt. Yeah. And if it doesn't work, not being afraid of that, but learning from it and then trying something different.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have that kind of mindset, then you end up in an environment that's very steady state.
Yeah.
And by the way, maybe in some businesses that is exactly the right kind of behaviour, where you don't want to change things, and you're in a more mature business perhaps, or in a certain environment, some of that might be the right conduct.
Yeah.
I think I personally would struggle in any business environment where it was just steady state, low growth, boring. Yeah. I've always wanted to try and make a difference, as I say, and hence the sort of culture that you try and create is one where people are willing to come with you, learn, work hard, get well rewarded as well. It's very important to create a meritocracy where people who perform get well looked after. That's really, really important. In many of the businesses I've had or been involved in, certainly the ones that I've owned, I even though I've been maybe the chief exec and the owner, I haven't always been the most highly paid person in the business. So you should never be afraid of paying the right rate for the best talent.
To the best talent.
Yeah.
And that culture is often driven from the top, so to speak. So if you're encouraging that, you know, I mean, I saw a sign a while back and it had fail, but it was first attempt in learning, as opposed to thinking about it as a fail, thinking about it as a first attempt in learning. I think that's a really good sort of, it was a good little saying. I like that.
No, absolutely, it's so true.
And then it's like, okay, well, we've done this, it hasn't quite worked out, but what hasn't worked, can we change it and things, and then continue to develop from there, you know? Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, in the best run businesses, that culture of continuous improvement and not being afraid to fail, you know, those are the best conditions in the best businesses, because you know, then people can learn, can strive to improve, and as I say, get well rewarded in the process. So
that's it. You're giving people the opportunity to make the best of themselves as well as making the best of yourself. Yeah,
I mean, again, it's not for me to comment, but I know in my own mind that the various people that have worked with me and for me over the years, one of my desires and what I think I've achieved is that by and large people have come out of that experience both financially better off, but intellectually having been stimulated and developed. And I'm not saying again that's all down to me, but you know, creating a culture where that applies and where that exists, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's it. The culture of an organisation is vital, I think.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
So coming up to the more up to date stuff, then I guess when you retired. He says in inverted commas. You chose to get involved with South Shields Football Club. So obviously, as you've said, South Shields, hometown, etc., etc. But how did that come about? What was behind all of that, Geoff?
Well, I'd love to say it was like a strategic plan, if you like, on my behalf. But I watched South Shields play very occasionally when they played we played at Simonside Hall. My late father and my late uncle would take me along to a few games. So I can't pretend that I was this avid South Shields fan, but the town, and indeed South Tyneside, I mentioned living in Jarrow for a large part of my sort of young adult life as well. So South Tyneside and South Shields has always been important to me. I got a letter from one of the committee guys. I hadn't realised that the club were playing their football down in Peterlee. So the club had basically been kicked out of their old ground. The lease had run out, and the previous chairman, well, no disrespect, but he didn't want to or couldn't renew the lease. I don't know the full circumstance, but the bottom line is the club were homeless. So we were playing down in Peterlee. I'd got this letter from one of the committee guys, Bob Ray, and I met Bob and Gary and various other members of the committee. I then at that point realised the kind of plight the club were in, and I just wanted to lend a hand. And I didn't really have this grand plan necessarily to scale it or to be as involved as I am, but I did want to help. And that started with me thinking, right, I'll go and talk to people at the council, see if we can find another ground, get the club to come home to South Shields. That didn't come off, and long story short, I bought the ground from the previous owner. He'd effectively sold it to a container park, but it was sold under like an option agreement. So the container business, which was Teesside based, needed planning permission to put their container park on the ground, and I basically just said, look, I won't name the gentleman, that wouldn't be fair, but I just said, look, you can either be remembered as the man who sold your hometown football club's ground to a container park, or you can sell it to me. And I just did the deal. It was the same number that he'd been offered by the container business, so I wasn't asking him for any discount or any favours. And I it's a long-winded answer, sorry, but I just we brought the club home, which was great. And then that was in 2015. I was obviously still working full-time at the time, but towards the end of my full-time job. And then increasingly over the years, I've got more and more involved. And whilst I'm chairman, I'm now sort of chief exec and chairman, so I run the club. again, got a great bunch of people around me. Very important to try and support them and drive them forward. And the club's moving on, significantly.
Yeah.
It's not without its challenges, Phil. We're still, if you look at the sort of P&L, the club's needing my help from a financial point of view, but we're edging out of that circumstance. We're getting closer to the club being sustainable.
Okay.
And we've got a very detailed financial plan, a very detailed financial model and business plan. And I'm very confident that in a very short space of time, the club will be fully sustainable.
Okay.
And as you might know, there's a number of possible options for the club, but I'm not getting any younger. So what's important to me is that, all right, I've started something at South Shields, but it's important that it continues beyond my tenure. So I'd like to think I could, there's a number of options, sell it to the fans, get local businesses involved. There's a number of possible scenarios that I'm kind of thinking through in my own mind.
Yeah.
But no urgent need to do anything just yet. But equally, we've already got about 1,000 fans who are shareholders in the club.
Yeah. Okay.
And I want to try and extend that. And ideally, maybe make it a proper community investment company, a proper community asset.
Yeah.
So that's one of a number of possible outcomes. But obviously, in the meantime, there's just a lot of hard work ahead, and there's an awful lot to do. Yeah. And I don't know whether you've ever been down at the ground recently, but we've opened a new stand. That got opened just a few months back now at the start of the season, so late summer. We've got a lot going on at the club, so, all right, the infrastructure's been improved.
Yeah.
But on top of the infrastructure, we've invested in our club academies. We've got an 11 to 16 academy with Mortimer College, where we've got kids from the age of 11 through 16, girls and boys, involved in sport. So, the whole agenda there is about health and well-being and getting kids more active. So we've got that 11 to 16 age group now that's, thriving. We've got our own main academy, if you like, the 16 to 19 age group, which is a bit more of a sort of elite academy for that age group. We've got some club academy teams as well. And we've also got our foundation. I set up a charitable foundation a few years ago. And we've got, it'll be approaching 1,000 kids now involved in sport and activity, largely football, but we do programs in local schools. We, there's everything from dance, boxing, but primarily football, but not entirely. So the point I'm trying to make, I could talk all day about it, but the club's got a number of sort of elements to it. And they're all moving forward in a very exciting way. And I'm pleased to say that the club, I hope anyway, does make a real positive social contribution to the town and to South Tyneside, to the borough. So it's been a busy period.
It's been a journey so far, but it does continue. I think it's really interesting that it's not just about that first team though.
Yeah.
You say, have I been to the ground? I actually came along to one of the pre-season games, and the setup there is absolutely fantastic, and the new stand looks incredible. So congratulations to you and everybody else involved with the club. It looks amazing. And because I hadn't been for a couple of years, probably pre-COVID was the last time I've been. So to go and see that setup is incredible, and I'd love to get into that a little bit more, but the whole community aspect, it's kind of that, rising tide lifts all boats, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Trying to improve the health and well-being of the kids through all sorts of sports and activities and stuff. Yeah, thank you.
I think the club has got an important role to play. All right, the first team results get some of the headlines, and I'd like to think that gives everybody a bit of a lift.
Absolutely.
And you see more and more people wandering around with South Shield shirts these days. So, I think the town and the borough have got kind of behind that. So that's great to see. But beyond the first team, as I just listed earlier, there's so many other things going on. The charitable foundation. We measure our positive social impact, so there's a proper formula for doing so. We've delivered well north of £10 million worth of positive social impact so far, and it's increasing all of the time. So, and that's not funded by anybody other than our own efforts and our own graft. And, you know, what's important to say is at a practical level, it's, as I said before, you know, all these children who might otherwise be less active have got an identity, they've got something that can be involved in. There's a whole host of social benefits to that, but also physical benefits. So yeah, I'm very proud of what the club's trying to achieve. There's still a long way to go, but as I said a short time ago, I'd like to think that the club's now on the cusp of being a sustainable football club and making a continued positive contribution to the town and the borough, and I want people to sort of continue to get behind it. We're very well supported, as you probably know, Phil. We are the best supported club at our level of football. We had just under 2,500 people there on Saturday for that FA Cup game against Scunthorpe, which was, I have to mention that, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not sure when this will be released, but it's important to note that this is on the Monday after the Scunthorpe game.
Yeah, of course.
So exciting for the draw tonight.
Yeah. Well, we're ball 53 in the draw tonight on BBC Two at 7 o'clock. But obviously, this interview may well be post-event, but we'll see who we get.
Yeah. No, congratulations again for that. It's phenomenal to sort of see that success. So the focus on the first team a little bit, when you first got involved, as you say, they were almost homeless and playing at Peterlee in front of a small crowd and things. So when you brought them back to Filtrona as was, what was your first sort of steps around that then?
Yeah, I smile because our average gate down at Peterlee was about 70. But equally, we had gates back in the day, and this is before my time, but, you know, of 10 or 12 people on a Tuesday night, you know. And the lads at the time, the committee guys, were doing everything they could just to rustle the money together to pay the officials, you know, selling the odd can of lager at the game. You know, it was literally hand to mouth. Yeah. And by the way, all credit to them for keeping the club going. Absolutely. Unbelievable.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows a lot of passion.
Unbelievable. Yeah. Well, a lot of the lads and lasses are still heavily involved now, you know. Janet is one of our vice presidents at the club now. You know, and she still works hard in one of the burger vans, basically. Bless her, you know. So she's serving all the food and the drink to fans on a Saturday. But she was one of a number. Gary Crutwell, of course. I mean, it'd be wrong to not name them all, but, you know, one or two jump to mind. Gary, who's now our vice chairman, and he's also our groundsman, and basically does everything he possibly can to support the club now. So sorry, I forgot the question really.
When you came
what the issues?
What was the first sort of steps?
Well, it's interesting. You know what? I think about it a lot because the club comes back, and you think, I could have thought, and I probably did. Oh well, that's that. You know, I've done my bit. The club's home. But of course, the reality was, and maybe it's just the way I'm wired as well, that I don't like doing things by half. That doesn't mean I'm not trying to be conceited or clever when I say that, but, you know, if you're going to do something, let's try and do it properly. And so really, having brought the club home, that was really the first step. I hadn't perhaps appreciated all that then had to be done, but the place hadn't had a lick of paint for like 20 odd years, you know. And so there was an awful lot of work to be done just to improve the facilities, even in the short term. So, you know, whether it was decorating, new central heating, rewiring, you know, there was a myriad of things that had to be done just to get the clubhouse right. I remember the first game and the first few games, me and my wife and others, but I remember particularly, you know, thinking, how many pies do we have to order, and how much beer, running up to Tesco's to get a few extra cans of lager because we'd had bigger crowds than we thought, which is great, you know. But it's a lot of fun looking back, you know, because it's everything from, and again, back to detail, you know, you've got to be right in amongst it, as is true for any business. But, you know, in the case of the football club, it was how many programs, how many pies, you know, how much beer. And honestly, board, and by the way, a lot of that still goes on to this day. You know, you have to plan and try and predict what crowds, and obviously we've got a much bigger operation now, and we're supporting typically 2,500 fans plus now on a home game. But yeah, so my early memories were just that, you know, just trying to, you know, very hands-on. Not just me, you know, lots of people with me helping and driving it forward. And as I say, you can't just sit there in this sort of ivory tower and say, oh well, you know, I've bought the ground and that's my job done. You've got to roll your sleeves up, and that's what I'd like to think I've done. And as I say, I've done it with the help of an awful lot of great people, and that continues. You know, we have, for example, you know, even now, you know, pre-match, the preparations involved. You know, you've got to predict or have an estimate of what you think your crowds are going to be, but there's a whole host of operational matters to consider: security, safety, food and drink, you know, hospitality. We've got a lot of sponsors, thankfully, for the club, but you know, we try and entertain them and make sure they're properly looked after. So yeah, there's a number of moving parts. It's there's never a dull moment, but again, I'm supported by a great bunch of people who do a lot of that for me.
I mean, that's, you know, it's great. You know, I mean, as somebody who follows local football, I've always had an interest in sort of having Jarrow and South Shields.
Yeah, of course.
It felt like a big step for South Shields in that development curve was when Lee Picton and Graham Fenton got involved.
Yeah.
And they kind of
well, what happened was, you know, I mean, Lee came along and then more latterly Graham joined him, and they were instrumental in creating the club academy, the 16 to 19 academy. They'd worked previously at Monk Seaton Academy, so they had lots of experience of how to do it. And so we just tried to sort of I tried to piggyback, if you like, their experiences, you know, and they had a lot of experience in that area, thankfully, and they did a great job. So we created our own 16 to 19 academy probably 4 or 5 years back now, 5 years ago, I would say. And that academy's grown. You know, we've got approaching 80 talented young lads now involved in that. And we run that through Sunderland College as well, so the academic qualification is being delivered by the college alongside us, but, you know, primarily by the college and primarily at the college, but some of the classroom work's done at Mariners Park as well. But yeah, Lee and Graham were absolutely instrumental in making that happen, and I can't take any credit for it. It was down to them.
But again, that, you know, your earlier point, you know, sometimes, you know, you said that you made a poor choice in regards to the CEO, sort of, but in regards to this. Those two guys, it was absolutely a great decision. Well, you don't
get every decision right, do you? You know, and
no.
I think what you got to try and strive for, though, is getting the right people around you, and as I said before, creating the right environment, and trying to create and encourage people to grow professionally and personally, but also obviously help the organisation grow. So, yeah, I definitely got that right with Graham and Lee. Sadly, you know, Graham's not with us any longer, but that's not a reflection on the job that he did for us in the academy. And, you know, football, like any industry, I guess it's quite a cutthroat, tough environment. And in the year that Graham left us, which was last January, we just hit a bit of a rocky patch, I guess. And as tough as it was, I made the decision that perhaps Graham had kind of run his course as first team manager. Not an easy thing to do or to execute on. And that's when, obviously, shortly afterwards, Kevin Phillips arrived.
So that decision around Graham, though, I take it that was taken by the board as a whole, but were you the man to deliver that decision, if you like?
Well, there was a lot of consultation with various parties, and yes, there is a board of directors, and we were all of the same mind, but ultimately, I guess it was my decision, and as difficult as it was, you know, that's what had to be done. In the sense that, you know, Graham had done a great job for us for a number of years, perhaps had lost the dressing room a little bit, and again, you know, if he was listening to this interview, he'd have a very different opinion, of course, but you know, that's, you know, in my view, that's where we were, and ultimately, to try and keep the club moving forward, I made the decision, difficult as it was, to sort of part company with Graham. We did it the right way, but you know, that was the decision, and as I say, not shortly afterwards, I'm pleased to say Kevin accepted an offer and he joined us.
Yeah, and again, locally that made real big headlines.
Yeah, well, it's funny because, Kev had kind of reached out to him. My son lives over in Durham, my youngest boy, and he'd mentioned that Kev was off in Ramside, and it just sort of sparked something in my thoughts that, he hadn't had an opportunity in management, even though he's got some good coaching experience. And I just reached out to him, got his number from a friend, and had a couple of texts and a couple of telephone conversations. And then he came up to meet me, and I'm pleased to say he saw what we are all trying to achieve at South Shields, and it kind of whet his appetite, got him excited and fired up. And so far so good. Yeah, Kev's doing a great job. So delighted he's here.
I mean, he couldn't fail to be impressed by the setup. As I say, to me, the ground looks fantastic. It really does. But I guess he was looking at the infrastructure behind that as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's difficult, because you could look at clubs at our level, and I'm not saying I'm this great expert on the matter, but there's a number of clubs where they've had a backer or a benefactor, and that person's thrown money at the playing staff, but not necessarily invested in the infrastructure. And unfortunately, that's destined for failure ultimately. So I've tried to apply it a little differently by, yes, you've got to invest in your playing resource, but you've also got to invest in infrastructure. So if you look at it now, all right, we talked about the new stand, but, the pitch, we've invested in that. We've got the 3G pitch for training purposes down there. And I'm a trustee at the Heartland and Westall Miners Welfare, and I was involved with the welfare for a period of time. And I mentioned the Football Club's Foundation. Well, the two charities have got the same charitable purpose, and it just so happened that the welfare probably needed a bit of help and support. So we've kind of aligned the interests of the Football Club's Foundation and the welfare site. The Heartland and Westall Miners Welfare, it's their site, and it's owned and run by the welfare, although supported by the club. So there was a little bit of, luck timing again there, because the welfare site had a requirement, we had a need. And the reason why I mentioned that was back to Kevin, that, we've now got, not only have we got all the investment that we've made at Mariners Park and the First Cloud Arena, but also we've got this fantastic training facility that we operate from. Although obviously we don't own the facility, it's owned by the welfare, but we're one of a small number of users. And again, we're trying to promote the welfare site and trying to get that become much more of a community asset. There was a risk before our involvement that it could have closed. So, imagine the shock rather, if had the welfare closed, that social value would have been lost forever, and so timing and luck and a bit of hard work, we kind of put the two charities together operationally. And as I say, the benefit for the football club is that we've got a fantastic training facility.
Absolutely.
And more importantly, perhaps, the community's still got that amazing asset down there for a whole host of other purposes.
Well, it allows fat old men like me to waddle about and still play for South Shields in my 40s.
Hey, well done. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Well done.
I appreciate that still goes. And both pitches there are both great pitches.
Yeah.
So, and as you say, the whole ground and stuff.
Yeah, well, now the football club and the foundation look after that on behalf of the welfare. And as you know, Phil, there's a number of users down there, not just you over 40s. I'd love to say you oldies, but I can't play that card anymore, can I? No. But yeah, we've got everything from bowls, boxing. There's everything down there. It's a great community asset, and I'm delighted that it's stayed open and that we've helped achieve that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So to come back to the club, obviously one of the main goals is for it to be sustainable, and once that does reach that threshold and it becomes that sustainable club, that eases things a little bit, I guess. But what would be your sort of overall ambition for the club?
Yeah, I suppose it's easy to think about that in the terms of footballing, first team results, but I think there's no reason why South Shields Football Club couldn't become a very credible National League club, or who knows, even maybe beyond that. I think it's important not to sound cocky or overly ambitious. Whatever we do, you've got to do it in the right way. And I'd like to think, we've been unlucky not to get out of the Northern Premier League over the last few years, with COVID particularly. Yes. But I think hopefully we can get out of this league this year, get in the National League North, maybe go again into National League. We've got a ground. To get to EFL, the ground grading is a requirement for 5,000 capacity, that's a minimum, and 2,000 seats. So our ground down there will meet that requirement. We haven't got the 2,000 seats just yet, but we've got planning approval to build another stand by the 3G, so that's all been approved. So we've got a very clear plan. So to answer your question, I'd like to think we can get ourselves quite quickly into the National League system, not just National League North, but into the National League. And then back to the point about sustainability, because it's what you can't have is just this blind ambition and try and rattle up the leagues and then just find that it's a castle built on sand and the whole thing falls apart. So I mentioned the numbers, and I also mentioned very boringly my personal experience, but, I've always ran businesses with a real focus on the numbers, so we've got a financial model at the club. We know every revenue driver. We know all of our costs. We report on it regularly. So my point is, again, not to be cocky, but it's important we understand those variables and we get them to that point of sustainability so that, we've got a revenue that we can not guarantee, but we've got a solid revenue base, and we've got a cost structure that is, it is sensible. It's always a balance, because obviously, if you look at the costs, if you're boring you with the P&L, but if you look at the P&L, there's a lot of it is about labour, people, players' wages, but also other overhead and other management and other people resource. So you've got to try and make sure that you're investing in that in the right way, and certainly with players' wages, you've got to make sure you hang on to that a little bit. We want to get the best quality players we can, but if you just, I'm exaggerating the point to make the point, just throw loads of money at the players' budget, before you know where you are, you might have some short-term success, and then suddenly, your pot dries up, and you're in trouble. So I've got to try and make sure that doesn't happen. So I mentioned, in answer to your question, where does the club, where could it be? I'd like to think, as I say, a national league club, a sustainable club with revenues that are stable, a town and a borough that backs it, a club that's continually delivering all of that positive social impact within the community, and then ultimately maybe a club that's owned by the community. That's what I'd like to achieve, and I think it can be done, and I think we're very close to achieving it. But there's no shortcut, it's a lot of hard work.
It's a lot of hard work and timing and,
timing and luck, Phil, that's another, I'm glad you mentioned that, because sometimes it's true for the football club, it's true for me personally, it's true for a lot of people, you've got to be in the right place at the right time. You've got to have a lot of hard work, you've got to apply yourself, graft, be persistent, but then that little sprinkle of luck and timing, just be. But I think, if you get all of those other things right and you're persistent, then it's eventually you'll get your just deserved. I hope. And again, I think there's no reason why the club can't achieve what I've outlined there. And I think my job is, this sounds a bit deep, but I'm like 60-year-old. I've had a few recent health scares, to be honest, and I've lost my father this year. Yeah, so it's a tough one. I could get quite emotional about that, actually, but just to say, none of us are here forever, and so it's important that I kind of leave the club in the right condition, without me, that's quite important. So I'm kind of working hard. Sorry, I got a bit emotional about my old man. But no, excuse me, what a fool. No, just to say that what's important is, you know, like if I keeled over, God forbid, but you know, none of us are here forever, and what I've got to do is make sure the club's in the right condition before, you know, before I do eventually exit. And as I kind of repeat myself a lot, Phil, but I think we're in a good place.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hard work ahead. We're not quite sustainable yet, but we're in touching distance.
Yeah.
And so, to repeat myself a little bit, you know, given what's happened to me this year, you know, the loss of my dad, my own health sort of not being quite right. In fact, far from quite right. You know, it's important that I kind of get the club to where it needs to be. And that doesn't mean I don't want to send any alarm bells here, but, you know, as I say, you know, who knows what's around the corner, and you've got to, I want to make sure the club's in the best possible state. That's really my primary objective.
Well, it'll be a hell of a legacy.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's put it that way. It'll be a hell of a legacy, and as somebody who follows local football,
Thank you.
I think you've done a fantastic job.
That's very kind of you. Thanks, mate.
And I congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you again for your time today.